Our next topic is operant conditioning. We've talked already about habituation, a little bit about sensitization. We spent some time talking about Pavlovian conditioning, and now we're talking about a different kind of conditioning. We're talking about operant conditioning. And by now, it should be clear that in all these processes, we're talking about changes in behavior, changes in the frequency, typically, of a behavior. Habituation, we're looking at a reduction in behavior due to the repeated presentation of a stimulus. In classical conditioning, or Pavlovian conditioning, we were talking about a change in behavior, typically an increase in behavior, the frequency or the likelihood of a behavior happening, because the stimulus that elicits that behavior has been paired with some other stimulus. In operant conditioning, we're talking about changes in the rate of a behavior or a rate of a response that happens due to the consequences of that response. Let me illustrate this with two examples. Take, for instance, the situation where you study for an exam. When you study for an exam, typically you do better than if you don't study for an exam. So the consequences of studying for an exam may be getting a good grade. The consequences of not studying for an exam is to get a poor grade. The consequences that studying for an exam may have are likely to have an impact in the frequency with which you study for exams. To the extent that studying for an exam results in good grades, and to the extent that good grades are an effective reinforcer, I'm going to talk about that in a second, to the effect that they are the effective stimulus, they are going to getting good grades is going to increase the likelihood that you are going to get that you are going to study for an exam in the future. On the other hand, as a separate example, engaging in criminal activity, let's say stealing, oftentimes results in consequences that are not desirable. And because of those consequences, the likelihood, if you experience, let's say, jail, if to the extent that that is an effective punisher, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, to the effective that those are effective, jail is an effective punisher, it may reduce the likelihood that you will engage in stealing behavior again in the future. So what we're talking about is two different kinds of consequences that behavior may have. One is that a consequence that results in a positive change in rate of response. We call those reinforcers, and the process is called reinforcement. And then there are those consequences that reduce the rate at which a response happens, and we call those punishers, and the process we call it punishment. Right? The focus of this video lecture is going to be on reinforcement. In a subsequent, there's going to be a subsequent topic exclusively about punishment and avoidance and escape and other avoidance control issues. So for now, we're going to focus exclusively on reinforcement. So to understand reinforcement, we need to identify what's often called the three-term contingency. And the three-term contingency is made of three elements: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent are the stimuli or the situation or the context in which the behavior happens. So if we're talking about, for instance, studying for an exam, the fact that an exam has been, that is due, that is announced, um, is an effective antecedent for that behavior. That antecedent uh, indicates that the behavior of studying for an exam is going to be reinforced. For instance, if this is during the semester, that makes sense. But if, for instance, if you are doing vacations, studying for an exam is not going to be reinforced. And so, whether you are in the semester, in the academic semester, or you are in vacations, is going to be very important to determine whether a particular behavior is going to be reinforced or not. So that constitutes the antecedent of that reinforced behavior. Now the behavior itself, sorry, we call that antecedent a discriminative stimulus. Often we call it an SD. And this is the stimulus that indicates that a particular response is going to be reinforced. We call it discriminative stimulus because presumably other stimuli distinct from the discriminative stimulus, different from the discriminative stimulus, does not indicate that behavior is going to be reinforced. Only the discriminative stimulus does it. And to the extent that when the discriminative stimulus is presented, that behavior occurs, that shows that the stimulus is being discriminated. The discriminative stimulus is being distinguished from other behaviors. So think about the following situation. Let's say you have let's say we have a rat. I'll draw a rat. Oh, it's a terrible rat. So this is your rat, and you are training the rat to press a lever for food. So what reinforces that behavior? So this over here is a lever, by the way. We're seeing it from the side, and so the animal, every time it presses the lever, food is delivered. A pellet of food is delivered, and but notice one thing. One of the things that you may do is you may actually establish it in such a way that only when this light is, let's say, red, pressing the lever is reinforced with food. Pressing the lever results in food. So this will be, if that's the case, then this will be your SD for this particular situation. But now suppose that you alternate that with a green colored light, and in that case lever pressing is not reinforced with food. So lever pressing has no consequences, and we call this the S delta. So what you should see is that the animal will start pressing the lever for the food pellets to the extent that the food pellet is an effective reinforcer, and the animal will not press the lever when the green light is on. And what that tells you, one of the things that it tells you, is that the animal can actually distinguish between the red light and the green light, because its behavior is under the control of that light. Okay, so I described already the behavior, but one of the things that I want to highlight is that we often refer to the behavior as the operant. An operant, by the way, is defined in terms of its effects on the environment. So notice that when I describe the behavior of the animal in this example, I indicated that it was pressing the lever, but I did not indicate how to press the lever. You probably picture pictured the rat pressing the lever with its paws, but technically, if the rat had pressed it with its paws, its tail, its hind legs, its head, or whatever, with chewing the lever, it doesn't make a difference in terms of the definition of the operant. The operant is defined by the consequences on the environment, by how the behavior affects the environment. And here, the way it is affecting the environment is by changing the position of a lever. Right? And so that's how we are going to define an operant. And finally, there's a consequence. In our example, this is the food pellet. And this is our reinforcer or punisher if it's something that reduces the frequency of the operant, will be a punisher. But we're assuming that the food pellet for a hungry animal works as a reinforcer, and in the sense that it increases the likelihood that in the presence of the discriminative stimulus, the operant will happen again. So antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Those are the three critical elements, A, B, C, the three critical elements, or the three-term contingency in the case of operant conditioning. Now, let me relate this to some of the topics we've studied before. I'm going to continue with this example because this is a relatively straightforward example. The rat pressing the lever in the presence of a color, but not of a different color. Right? Remember how we defined the situation of habituation and sensitization. We said we assumed that an unconditioned stimulus elicited an unconditioned response, and the repeated presentations of the unconditioned stimulus may result in changes in the unconditioned response, be a decrease in the case of habituation or an increase in the case of sensitization. And we said also that if we pair that US, that unconditioned stimulus, to a CS, then that CS may come to elicit a conditioned response, right? And so this an electric foot shock may elicit a startle response, but when we pair a tone, let's say, to the shock, then the tone comes to elicit a freezing, and only comes to elicit freezing behavior by virtue of the CS being paired with the US, the tone being paired with foot shock. Now you may wonder, how does operant conditioning fit within this schema? It's relatively straightforward, but I wanted you to think about it a little bit. Think of what happens if that conditioned response mediated the association, or the contingency between CS and US. If CS and US are only paired if a particular response happens to the CS. Think, for instance, in the case of Pavlovian conditioning, when we were talking about foot shock as the US and foot shock as the US and a tone as the CS. Whether the animal froze or not had no consequences, did not influence at all the fact that the animal was going to get foot shock. Now, what would happen if the behavior of the animal had an effect on whether it received foot shock or not? Let's suppose that the animal was able to escape, to move to a different room when the tone is presented. You would expect that the animal will move away, and to that extent the CS will not be paired with foot shock because the animal will be escaping the foot shock. And the CS may in fact be paired with may signal that a particular response is going to cancel the US. How about in this example? In the example of the lever pressing and lever pressing for food in the presence of one light versus not the other light. Think of it this way. The CS in this case is the same as what we're calling here DSD. It's our discriminative stimulus, which is in a way paired with our food pellet. That is our reinforcer. Right? These two are paired. In the presence of the red light, the presence of the red light, food happens, but not in the presence of the green light. And food happens in the presence of the red light only if lever pressing takes place. So the association between discriminative stimulus and food, which is similar to CS and US, happens in this case in operant conditioning only if the condition response, in this case the operant, occurs. Okay? So think about any other situation, any reinforcement situation, any situation in which a response happens, changes in frequency due to its consequences. Try to identify the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence in your situation and map it to this situation. You'll see that in every case you're going to have two stimuli that are paired, but they're only paired because of the presence of a response, of a particular response. Okay. Now let me erase this now and talk about how to arrange reinforcement effectively. I'll talk briefly about this. Some of these things, actually you saw them in Pavlovian conditioning. They actually work very similarly in operant conditioning. For instance, the amount and quality of the reinforcer, of the consequence, is important. Similar to the salience, amount, and physical characteristics of the US in the case of Pavlovian conditioning. If you're pairing tone with food shock, and food shock is really weak, you're not going to get strong conditioning. Or if you pair lever pressing with really unappealing food, or with a very low quantity of food, then probably reinforcement is not going to be very effective. That's not going to maintain a lot of behavior. The other, another factor that's important here is the motivation for the reinforcer. Same thing as with Pavlovian conditioning. If you pair a tone with food and you expect to get salivation, you are typically going to see it in a hungry animal. You will not see it in a satiated animal. The same thing with lever pressing for food. You will not see an animal lever pressing for food if the animal is not hungry. It has to have a motivation to get that reinforcer. Delay of reinforcement is also very important. Reinforcement is more effective if it is delivered immediately after the operant is presented. Similar to the CS-US pairing situation in Pavlovian conditioning. Remember, in that case, if the CS was presented long before the US was presented, the CS is unlikely to elicit a conditioned response. But if it's presented right before the US, then the CS is a lot more effective in eliciting a conditioned response. Similarly, in operant conditioning, if the response is immediately followed by reinforcement, then reinforcement is going to be very effective. But if the response is followed minutes later by the reinforcer, it's not going to be nearly as effective. The last characteristic that I want to mention about the arrangement of reinforcement has to do with reinforcement contingency. We're going to spend more time talking about this when we talk about schedules of reinforcement. Suffice it to say here, though, that if reinforcement is not clearly correlated with the reinforced response, reinforcement is not going to be very effective. So, for instance, if you provide a lot of free food to the animal in a lever pressing for food situation, the animal is not going to lever press that much because food is not clearly correlated with lever pressing. We oftentimes talk about food being, or the reinforcer being, coupled with the response. If the reinforcer can happen without the response is not going to happen that often. Just like in Pavlovian conditioning, if the US happens very often without the CS, or if the CS is presented without the US, in this case, in the case of operant conditioning, if the response happens a lot without reinforcement, it's possible that, it's very likely you're not going to get strong conditioning in either case.